Okay, we left off with our general chart of the Reformation versus the Counter-Reformation. The Bible in the hand and in the language of the common man versus no Bible in the hand of the common man in his language. The Calvinists versus the Jesuits. Those who would resist tyranny with a sword through their government, through the leadership of kings that would do the right thing to keep their subjects from being unduly persecuted by the Pope. Remember, all persecution is from Rome. No matter where it comes from, any political persecution of any particular country towards any other people ultimately can be traced to the Jesuits running the papacy. All of them. So, we're going to deal now with what's called the Puritan Revolution in England. That revolution will run for approximately 10 years. Off the top of my head, 1642 to 1652. King Charles was becoming a tyrant. Charles I. And doing a series of things against Magna Carta. He was also becoming religiously intolerant too. Intolerant of the Reformation taking place in England as it was developing. Remember, the King James Bible had been completed in the reign of his father, King James, completed in 1611. And it was gradually supplanting the Geneva Bible. So at the time of the Puritan Revolution, the Geneva Bible had been replaced by the Bible believers in England, they preferring the AV 1611 over the Geneva Bible. So, in fact, I have one here. I have one that was in the days of Cromwell. And it's an AV 1611 Bible that was probably carried by one of his soldiers. I don't open it because it'll fall apart. This is the Bible they carried. Okay, so Puritan Revolution of 1642 to 1652, Cromwell will be a leader in it, and ultimately at the end he will be the leader on behalf of Parliament. Because Parliament resisted the king. In England, Great Britain, you have two sovereigns, the Parliament and the king. Okay? And so the Parliament passed what was called the Great Remonstrance. I never heard of it until a previous pastor of mine, Nelson Turner, told me about it. In this Great Remonstrance, and he gave me the whole copy of it, it's like 190 things that they objected to of what the king did. It's called the Great Remonstrance. In 1641. Parliament passed it by a mere 8 votes. Cromwell said, if the Remonstrance would have not passed, I would have sold all that I had and moved to the New World. Because if you're going to resist tyranny, it has to be through the arm of government. Otherwise, you got anarchy. So, Great Remonstrance passed by 8 votes. Some 190 objections to the rule of Charles. I think it's like 191, something like that. Charles I was the son of King James I, who King James unfortunately became soft on the papacy in the last 10 years of his reign. And so he produced a son that would be soft on the papacy and do a series of things favoring the Pope and the Jesuits. For which reason this Great Remonstrance was passed. 1641. The particular key point in the Remonstrance for this presentation is that the king, Charles I, brought admiralty inland, the Admiralty jurisdiction. Admiralty is the jurisdiction for the high seas. And it has to do with commerce and war. Admiralty is the law that governs the warships on the high seas as well as the commercial vessels on high seas. That's why there is both a criminal and civil jurisdiction of admiralty. I used to teach it was only civil until I was corrected by Joseph Story in his work, Commentaries on the Constitution, where he made it clear that there was a criminal jurisdiction also. I should have known that, but I was in error for several years teaching only civil jurisdiction. Another individual corrected me in a very untoward way when he could have called me, but instead chose to attack me. So, I had already made the change. Admiralty had both civil and criminal jurisdiction, and the king brought admiralty inland to replace common law. Because common law protected a man in his house. The king couldn't just go in his house. In admiralty jurisdiction, he can. Admiralty jurisdiction, why? Because admiralty jurisdiction follows the Roman civil law, where there are no inalienable rights. No fundamental rights in Roman civil law. By the way, Louisiana is under Roman civil law. It's the only state under Roman civil law. All the others had common law and equity. So, this was a huge point of objection to Charles I's rule, in that he brought admiralty inland. Who do you think inspired him to do that? Why the Jesuits? Because if they bring admiralty inland, they're going to displace the common law, and they will enthrone the Roman civil law on the land in the name of admiralty jurisprudence. In Roman civil law, all you have is privilege granted from the king. Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, which that religion went from Persia to Greece to Rome, so that the Caesar became like the king of Babylon. He was the king of Rome, and so you have only Roman civil law. The whole body of Roman civil law is developed by Justinian in Constantinople in like the 6th century, but it was the essence of Roman civil law has been the law of all your pagan, dictatorial, absolute divine right kings of the past. Russia is under Roman civil law. China is under Roman civil law. All your communist countries are under Roman civil law, under their dictators, and they have the audacity to call themselves republics. The USSR, Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, the People's Republic of China, those are Jesuit republics. They are not Calvinistic republics. Those republics of the Jesuits always have military dictators. Calvinistic republic does not have military dictators. The people have the freedom of conscience, speech, and press, and to invent and be engaged in commerce. And unless they commit some common law crime damaging somebody's life, liberty, or property, they can do whatever they want to do. And that's the way it ought to be. So, they began to introduce the admiralty jurisdiction in England, which is the Roman civil law, and this was a very, very important reason why the revolution took place. One of the reasons. Okay. This is important now because we're going to talk about the American establishment of the common law and equity. So, okay, continuing on here, we're now going to go talk about the American Constitution, a very simple document. It's in 7 articles. Any 5th grader can understand it if you just read it for what it says. Just like the Bible. You read the Bible for what it says. It says what it means what it says. The Constitution says what it means what it says. We don't need the priest to tell us what it really means. We don't need a priest to tell us what the Bible really means. Okay? That's all Romanistic stuff. So, with our successful revolution that we were never intended to win, that God intervened and gave us a victory over the English during the American Revolution for 8 years, from 1775 to 1783. God choosing to use Roman Catholic France to come and help us with the great Marquis de Lafayette. the boy general, who George Washington treated as his own son. They even oftentimes slept in the same tent together. Without George Washington, there is no successful revolution. He was raised on the King James Bible by his mother, who was Episcopalian. In those days, the Episcopalians believed the Bible. Later, George Washington would convert and become a Baptist under the preaching of his favorite chaplain, whose name was John Gano. And John Gano would baptize George Washington in the Hudson River in the presence of 100 witnesses. So don't tell me George Washington was some pagan Freemason working for the Pope. That's idiocy and stupidity. And for that, by the way, because George Washington is the father of a heretic nation, that's why the Jesuits will use Tobias Lear the Fourth, Tobias Lear the Fifth, to poison him with anthrax. But that's another topic. We have our wonderful American Constitution. It goes into effect in 1789. It was perfected in Philadelphia in 1787. It takes 3/4 of the states to ratify, so 9 of the colonies, 9 of the states, I should say, ratified by 1789, and it goes in effect in 1789, not 1787. In this Constitution, one of the articles, Article 3, is judicial power. That's where we the people delegated our judicial power because we are the sovereign as a people. There's no individual sovereigns. We as the sovereign, we the people, delegated our sovereign judicial power to the Supreme Court. That's where all of our judicial power resides, on a federal or federal level for now. The Article 3 also said that the Congress shall have power to create inferior courts. So what Congress did in the Judiciary Act of 1789, by the way, same year, when the first act passed, the Judiciary Act of 1789, the Judiciary Act created circuit courts and district courts. So the district courts that we see today in the country were created in 1789, and there's nothing wrong with them. These district courts were given Article 3 judicial power by the creation of the Congress, and that's exactly what the Constitution says. So these district courts received Article 3 judicial power. That's why they're called Article 3 courts. A judge that's sitting in a federal district court is an Article 3 judge, unless it's a magistrate judge. And magistrate judges were created in 1965, and they are Article 1 judges from the legislative power that we the people delegated to Congress. That's like a bankruptcy court judge and other things. They're Article 1 judges. But they're sitting in an Article 3 court. And the Article 3 judges are the ones that are deciding the cases and so on. The magistrate judge is like a gopher. They just do the legwork for the Article 3 judge. Then the Article 1 judge, the magistrate judge, recommends this is what the Article 3 judge ought to do, and then the Article 3 judge generally does it. But there were no magistrate judges before 1965. All we had was Article 3 judges for the Article 3 district courts. Okay? District courts created by the Judiciary Act of 1789. Remember those things. Now, in Article 3, it talks about the judicial power, whether they be cases at law, meaning common law, equity. Equity follows the common law. It's supplemental to it. And then admiralty maritime. Admiralty maritime is the same jurisdiction. Sometimes it's called admiralty, sometimes it's called maritime. Okay? And these were the 3 jurisprudences that are mentioned in Article 3 of the Constitution. Law, equity, and admiralty maritime. That an Article 3 judge could preside over in a case. Okay? Beautiful. Wonderful. Glory to God. It's what a repentant, white, Bible-believing population deserved. We deserve this. at that time. So God gave it to us through a handful of men. In 1842, some, 53 years later, there will be a case that comes to the Supreme Court regarding commerce. And the case is called Swift versus Tyson. In this case of Swift versus Tyson, it was decided by the Supreme Court in 1842, and it was a unanimous decision of all the 9 justices. Unanimous. The one who delivered the opinion was the great, the learned Justice Joseph Story. And to appreciate his acumen, you got to read his commentaries on the Constitution. He comments on every line of the Constitution. It's as thick as 2 volume set. I have it. Brother Eric got it for me. And so this was the holding case. This decision said that there was a common law. They didn't call it federal general common law then. That would be a term for the Erie decision. But they said there's a common law in the federal courts that we don't have to follow the state common law. Giving the Supreme Court the liberty to decide matters pursuant to their own common law that they had. And that's the essence of that case. Don't get lost in the details. The Jesuits hated Article 3 judicial power with common law and equity. They loved Roman civil law, so they had to come up with a plan to do away with the common law in a federal district court, as there is no common law today, historic American common law in a federal district court. There is federal common law, but it was created after 1938, after the Erie decision, and it's judge-made common law, and it's emergency war powers federal common law. It is not the old civilian due process of federal general common law that is defended by the Swift versus Tyson. Always remember that. There's the old federal general common law, the supreme until 1938, which I'll get to that next. And then there's the new federal common law that's judge-made based upon cases. And that is a common law that is within the emergency war powers military jurisdiction of every federal court in this country. So when I say there's no more federal common law, I mean there's no more general federal common law. I don't mean there's no more common law. That common law is the wicked and sinful and Jesuitical, judge-made, arbitrary federal common law that comes after 1938, after the Erie decision. So maybe I should go into that right now. So, you see the judicial power, Article 3, Supreme Court, lower courts. They have Article 3 jurisdiction to hear common law, equity, and admiralty maritime matters. Swift versus Tyson protects a common law in a federal court, and it stands until 1938. Stands until 1938. In 1938, remember, it had been talked about for 20 years or more of doing away with Swift versus Tyson. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a traitor, a Yankee lawyer. There's a book on him called Yankee Lawyer. He was a traitor. He was, even though he became a master of the common law and he wrote a book on the common law, he's secretly conspiring with his Masonic Jesuit-controlled brothers to do away with federal common law that is secured by Article 3, to replace it. And to replace it, you have to have a temporary change in government that justifies setting it aside and replacing it. So the Jesuits will master how that's going to happen. But their whole game is to get rid of common law, this American common law secured on a federal level by the Swift versus Tyson case. Okay? That's the great design. So, take a break for a second. I'm going to put up 1938 here in the Erie decision, and so that you can see what happened in 1938. All right, 1938. We'll go to 1938. We have the Erie Railroad Railroad Company versus Tompkins. No more federal general common law. And the question, not before the court. And the one who gives the opinion Justice Louis Brandeis. So the Jews can be blamed for Erie someday. Okay. Okay, begin now. We're going to start continuing on. So we see how Swift versus Tyson protected a federal general common law from 1842 to 1938, because this particular case here is going to overrule Swift versus Tyson of 1842. The Erie Railroad decision of 1938, Erie Railroad Company versus Tompkins. It's a Pennsylvania case. The guy was hit by a train, and so they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. I maintain it was designed by the Jesuits to do this, because they had to do away with a federal general common law some way. So they concocted this accident, and they brought it all the way to the Supreme Court, as they would the Slaughterhouse decision of 1873. And so they bring this case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides there's no more federal general common law. When they did that, they overruled Swift versus Tyson of 1842. This was a revolution. The Erie decision is a wicked, sinful, ungodly, papal, tyrannical decision of the Supreme Court. And the two pillars of all the federal district courts today and how they proceed is Erie and the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. And that's according to the Tidewater case. One of the justices attacks the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure in Erie, and these are the two foundations for how the courts proceed. So, that's what the Erie decision did. Finally, the Jesuits have done away with a federal general common law secured by Article 3 of the Constitution. And they did it during a time when emergency war powers military government was imposed in 1933. So I will teach you that after this. They could have never made that ruling with civilian due process under a civilian government that existed from 1789 to 1933 until FDR did away with it temporarily. Okay? So, no more federal general common law. Well, there will be common law after this, but it's a judge-made common law with an emergency war powers military jurisdiction that they will impose in 1938, right after this decision. As soon as this decision will take place, Section 17 of the Trading with the Enemy Act, where the Trading with the Enemy Act gave a special jurisdiction, war powers jurisdiction to the district courts to decide matters that would arise under Trading with the Enemy Act, which there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. But when you put the whole country under Trading with the Enemy Act, as of 1933, when FDR is going to impose his emergency war powers military government for this national banking emergency, when you put the whole country under that, now you can do away with the federal general common law of Erie, which is 5 years after 1933, and then you can overturn Swift versus Tyson that protected a federal common law with civilian due process. And what fills this vacuum of common law, due process of law, will be an emergency war powers military due process of law of Section 17 of the Trading with the Enemy Act, which is Title 50, 4316. Look it up. Title 50, Section United States Code, Section 4316, 4316, yeah, is the statute that imposes this special jurisdiction of the Trading with the Enemy Act that every federal district court in this country sits. That's why they're flying this military color in every federal district court. None of them fly a flag without gold fringe or without a gold cord and tassels. I was in a court in Kansas City, Missouri, and they didn't have the gold fringe on it, but they had the gold cord and tassels. That's military colors. Every federal court sitting in an emergency war powers military jurisdiction of the United States Code 50, United States Code 4316. There has to be a statute for the court to fly these military colors. And no judge will ever admit it to you, because I had several judges that I talked to them in my pleadings about. I've probably been in 6 or 7 federal cases. And 2 or 3 of them I brought up this issue of the military color. None of them would reply. This is their great secret. This is not admiralty jurisdiction. This is military jurisdiction. The Patriot movement has it all wrong. It's military. And in a military jurisdiction, they can decide things in admiralty, they can decide things in their new Roman equity, and they can decide things in their new federal common law under their military jurisdiction. But the military jurisdiction covers everything. Okay? But going back to Erie versus Erie and Tompkins. So this decision of 1938 is going to overturn Swift versus Tyson of 1842. This is the Roosevelt court. This is the court where FDR packed the court after 2 conservative Republicans just happened to resign. And he put 2 left-wing socialist communist Democrats on the Supreme Court, Stanley Reed and Hugo Black. Hugo Black was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason, and he was a member of the 2nd Ku Klux Klan that had started in 1915 at Stone Mountain, Georgia. Remember, there's 2 clans. I'd have been a member of the first one. But this second one, totally in the hands of the Jesuits, hating all Catholics, Jews, and blacks. So, 1938 Erie Railroad case is given as 5 years after 1933, when a 1933 military government is imposed in the country with FDR, which I'll cover in a little bit. In 1938, here now, overrules Swift versus Tyson, and when they decide there's no more federal general common law, and get a load of this, in the dissent of that case, in the dissent of Erie, I believe it's Justice Butler, he says, the question was not even before the court. I repeat, the question was not even before the court as to whether or not they're going to do away with federal general common law. Now, whenever an appeal is taken to the Supreme Court, today it's on what's called a writ of certiorari, but when they take an appeal to the Supreme Court, you have to present a question for them to address. And that's what they're constrained to do, deal with that question. This question of whether or not to do away with federal general common law was not presented to the court. And they decided to do this anyway. Those are the criminals on Franklin Damnable Roosevelt's Supreme Court in 1938. And one of the greatest criminals of all was the guy who delivers the opinion, and he happens to be a Jew, and he's the first Jew ever appointed to the Supreme Court. I think he was appointed by, who was it? The one they poisoned, killed him. It was Woodrow Wilson. Okay? So they appoint the first Jew to the Supreme Court. So we're going to make this Jew deliver Erie. So when a future day would come, who's responsible for that Erie decision? Why, it's the Jews. It's those filthy Jews. It was Louis Brandeis that did it. Did you see how the Jesuits fashioned this? So they can blame the Jews for their crimes? That's what they did. Louis Brandeis used to be a good guy. Louis Brandeis opposed the Federal Reserve Act. Louis Brandeis said the Federal Reserve Act was a compact with Satan. Something happened to him. Something changed him. And so he went along with this. Now, he delivers the opinion. It wasn't those other criminals like Harlan Fiske Stone and Chief Justice Hughes. They wouldn't deliver the opinion. We got to give it to a Jew so we can blame the Jews for doing away with the federal general common law of Article 3, protected by Swift versus Tyson for, wow, almost 100 years. Do you see the magnitude of this? I hope I'm teaching it clearly. All right, so that's what the Erie Railroad decision did. And when this happened, when they did away with federal general common law, the court will no longer sit in civilian due process of Article 3 anymore. Article 3 anymore. They will sit in an Article 1 emergency war powers military due process for everything criminal and everything civil. And they will sit in that jurisdiction since 1938. And it's an emergency war powers military jurisdiction that proceeds according to the course of Admiralty jurisprudence, the same Admiralty jurisprudence of England that was one of the reasons for the Great Remonstrance in 1641. Okay? All right, so that's the Erie decision. That's all you need to know about that.